Happy Weirdness Day! Hey guys, we're back again on another Wednesday. This is our podcast on Wednesdays We Talk Weird. Here we're going to talk about everything from the ooky
to the spooky.
So, we were initially going to talk about astrology this week. However, after kind of researching it, we found out that it is
a giant rabbit hole.
Yeah, I mean it's a pretty huge topic to cover. We might come back and revisit it on a later date. We might put it into parts. But for now we're kind of scrapping that idea, so that's where we're at with it. But me and Ivy, we have actually been quarantined together, and we've been watching a lot of stuff on the Netflix here. And one thing that we ended up watching, it's a docu-series called Wild Wild Country. And it's actually really interesting. It's about the Rajneeshis, and it got us talking about, we kind of ended up having this debate about cults and kind of what makes a cult and, stuff like that. So this week's topic is we're going to go ahead and talk about cults. So, But yeah, I mean, obviously, like the big ones, like the Manson family, everybody knows about Charles Manson and his people,
Waco.
Waco, yeah, Waco's a big one. That's kind of course, Jim Jones and his people, the Heaven's Gate people. I mean, those are all really bad establishments, right? I mean, but it's not that's not the only thing that qualifies as a cult. Once you start getting into it, you kind of find that there are these other, organizations that you might not think are like a cult. So we're going to kind of cover, a little bit of everything and talk about, the different types and, the differences between them. So I don't know, where should we start? Do you want to start with the bad ones or?
I mean, I think they get a bad rap, so I think we should kind of start with something that's a little more mainstream.
Okay.
Something that people can understand a little bit more and not have a stigma necessarily attached to it, which I feel like every kind of religious organization is going to have.
Right.
But, the most common one, I guess you could say, would be, Christianity. It's not in every form.
Right.
A cult, but in some parts of the religion, it can definitely be seen as such. So, I mean, that could be a good starting point.
Yeah, it's definitely got that it's definitely got that cult-like mentality to it. It's basically, I mean, what is a cult? I guess we'll start there. What constitutes as a cult? I guess really it would be any group of people that follow kind of one way, that they kind of have one,
they fall
state of
under
mind.
The category of being manipulated and controlled.
Yeah, they do. Well, I mean, I would say that could be part of a cult, but I wouldn't necessarily say that that's what defines a cult. I would think it's just me personally, I think that it's more of a group of people that follow a certain way or a certain lifestyle, and that could be, damn near anything. But, then of course when you're talking Christianity and stuff, they all follow a certain type of way. They have rituals and, things like that they do, regularly that goes along with that kind of mindset. But it can be a harmful thing, Yeah.
It also depends on the kind of emphasis you put on the word too. Cult classics, that doesn't really have a negative connotation, but it still kind of has that cult-like feel.
It has that mentality.
It has a strong following.
Right. Well, right. It's got that cult-like mentality. One thing that I know, everybody's talking about, obviously we have talked about a lot, is, of course, Tiger King.
Right.
And those people, they're all, they have that they're kind of a cult. The big cat people are kind of a cult. They all they live their life based off of one certain aspect of it, and that's centered around big cats. Whether you're on, Joe's side of it, where he's, doing the breeding and stuff for certain, for conservation, or you're on, Carol's side of it, right? That bitch Carol Baskin. Or if you're, Doc Antle with his fucking harem that he had of women,
Right.
those are kind of, I mean, that's a cult. I mean, that's no different than, you know, from fucking Heaven's Gate. You know what I mean? Except not everybody dies in the end.
Right.
Only Don Lewis died in the end of that. So.
Well, I mean, there's like this central idea that's kind of bringing all of these people together.
Right, exactly. And that's kind of, when you talk about cults, that's what it is. They don't necessarily have to have that negative stigma tied to it. It just really depends. So, with religion, just religion in general, I mean, Christianity, of course, is a big one. But I mean, you grew up in that kind of,
Yeah.
situation. Why don't you share a little bit about that? I mean,
Well, the whole situation of it was just really weird. People had different obligations that they had to fill based off of their gender. So, a man is to supply for the home, and a woman is to take care of the home and the children and things like that. Now, it wasn't to such a strict degree that, say, women couldn't work,
Right.
but, it's not uncommon that an apostolic housewife wasn't just a housewife. And, that's not to say that being a housewife is anything negative. That's
right,
actually a very tough job,
right,
If your home is your job, like, there's no reason that you can't have your house clean. There's no reason that you can't prepare a meal. Like, there's obligations that come along with it that make that task alone challenging, especially when the responsibility lies on one individual solely.
Oh yeah, dude. Being a housewife is fucking difficult. I was a housewife for 2 years.
Yeah, it's definitely not easy,
Yeah.
and I feel like even that alone gets a bad rap. People
Right.
consider it lazy or
Whatever,
you
sure.
know, trying to find a sugar daddy type situation, and that's not always the case.
Right.
But so within that, there was things like, women couldn't cut their hair, they couldn't wear
Right.
makeup, couldn't wear jewelry. Men weren't even allowed to wear shorts. They had to cut their hair, couldn't go past their eyebrows or their ears, which is like, why is that the standard? Like, where did this come from? Like, why
Well, it's
is
like
that?
what if they didn't abide by those rules, they were going to hell? Is that is that what is that the punishment there?
I think that's how some people viewed it, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that was just
Well,
their obligation that they felt they needed to fill
right.
through their religious purpose. So
For
I
whatever
feel like
reason.
if it would be looked down upon from the church itself.
Yeah.
It'd be like, you need to cut your hair, but I don't necessarily think that it has any kind of specific religious tie.
Yeah.
Now, the women not cutting their hair is considered the veil. So,
Okay.
it kind of relates a lot to like Native American practices where, it's not as deep in my opinion, when it comes to like the Native Americans, they basically believe that your hair is like an antenna. So, you're more receptive to energies. You're able to pick
I've
up
never
on
heard
things.
that.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
That's like most hunters had long hair because, I guess they could feel the wind differently or, whatever it may be. I'm not Native American. I don't claim to be Native American or anything like that. So I can't really speak on it to such a degree,
Right.
but, that is what I have read about.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's really interesting. A lot of Native American culture is very interesting, but it like a lot of religions, they tend to have similar qualities. Like a lot of the stories that are told through many religions are essentially the same story, just different characters and different areas of the world.
Well, and you said like you said a specific word. You said culture, and so it's like
Cult. Sure.
Well, culture, right. But is it, is it part of the culture or is it because it's a cult? I mean, I think personally the difference between the two is a very thin line.
Right.
But I think that, where you get that cult mentality is when you are taking things to the extreme.
Yeah. I also think it comes from incorporating a higher entity.
Usually.
When it comes to culture, it's more of a way of life. When it comes to
Right.
a cult, it's more of a way of practice
Well, it's
or
a way of spirituality
yeah,
rather than
it's
just a
way of,
lifestyle.
right. It's like a way of following,
Right.
and kind of really solidifying what your actions say towards your cause.
True. Yeah, that's true. That's true. I guess I haven't really thought about the difference there. When you do think of like major cults, they do typically have, some type of,
Messiah.
higher being. I mean, the Heaven's Gate people, it was, space Jesus. And, then you have, well, I mean, I guess with Charles Manson, his was more society was the higher power.
Right.
Because with him, he was all about, he wanted to start a race war. He wanted to kind of take down the man. I mean, he had a lot of really good ideals. And I know people are probably going to shit on me for saying that. But he wasn't completely incorrect. It's just the way he went about it was incorrect.
Right. And that's when it comes to cults, it's not necessarily so much what they stand for is wrong.
Yeah.
It's usually the way they go about things that is actually wrong.
Right.
Like with Wild Wild Country.
Yeah.
Their cause was great, but then it was like once they got pushback from people, then they really just
They took it too far.
they lost it.
They
just,
did.
But it kind of goes back to the apostolic people. They have this superiority to them that they feel they have to infringe on the rights of others and
Right.
have to go and be against LGBTQIA plus communities and
Right.
things like that, and women that have been divorced, and it's like, and it's crazy because sometimes that stuff is so favored. Like when it comes to women and divorce, it's like, okay, well, what about the man?
Right. Right.
So much focus is put on other individuals aside from like the root cause.
Right, exactly. Well, because, obviously some of those things can't, sometimes you can't control getting a divorce or,
Right.
it's called for, it's just, it's ridiculous how, some of the ideals kind of end up getting, just because I'm sure that they started off as, really logical.
Right.
And that's what I'm saying with the extremes. Like, I'm sure they started off with some good reason to feel a certain type of way about certain ideals. But times change for one.
Exactly.
People change, society changes, and these people have to learn how to change with the times. Otherwise, I mean, they're going to end up being just they're going to end up stuck in their superiority complex. Well, just like, again, back to the Rajneeshis. When they came into that town, the Antelope, and so I guess we'll kind of start over. We'll give a little bit of explanation here. The Rajneeshis built a community in Oregon, and it was a commune. And I mean, they were a peaceful people, and they just kind of worked for themselves and with themselves and for the community.
And mostly highly educated people.
And they were, yeah. They a lot of the people on there were extremely intelligent. Within their community.
Liquidated their assets. They used the education that they have gained
Right.
to
To
allow
form
this commune to
Exactly.
rise.
Exactly. So what happened was, I mean, basically the government came in and, was, pissed off that they were kind of doing their own thing and living off the land. So they were trying to find a way to kick them out. The solution that they found was to go to the next town over, is a little town called Antelope, and it said it was a population of like 40 people at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And they were going to buy the properties on the land to be able to kind of own that town so that they could work their way into the government aspect of it and have more control over their commune. Well, the people of the town didn't take too kindly to it.
Well, I mean, the townspeople really pushed them into doing that too. It wasn't just like they were like, "Oh, we need to take over." You know,
Well, there was nothing wrong with what they were doing in the beginning. They were just buying properties that were already up for sale. You know, they were just doing. I mean, what they were already all the rights they were given to do. It's just that they weren't trying to really take over the town per se. But you know, the town itself was a dying town anyway.
right.
You know, the 40 people left.
Well, and they didn't even start buying the properties until the town was actually pushing back on them and, basically telling them that they're not welcome, that they
Well, I
don't
thought that
understand
was
what's
more
going
the
on.
government itself rather than because they were making their own water systems and you know stuff like that.
Well,
They didn't
that
like
stuff
that.
came later. I think it was a Thousand Friends of Oregon that actually
That's right.
started the whole thing,
That's
but that
right.
actually might be a government agency. I don't know. I've never really looked into it, but first it was the townspeople, then it was a Thousand Friends of Oregon, and then it was like the larger government that
Okay.
really started to crack down.
Well, I mean, but either way, the Rajneeshis they ended up um, almost buying out this entire town. And you know, when they did that, a lot of the townspeople were people that were already they were older, they were already set in their ways, and you know they didn't like that, which is kind of ridiculous because people from all over the world would come to this town and visit. They had a hotel there. They owned like multiple little discos and diners and things like that. They were bringing money into this town.
Yeah,
I
well, they
mean-
also had stuff in Portland too. It wasn't like
Right. Well,
it was
eventually,
stimulating
yeah,
the
eventually.
economy
Exactly.
as a whole,
And they
it
weren't
was
doing
bringing life.
and they weren't doing anything wrong. It's just that they lived a different way and they had different practices than people thought. The big thing of it was people thought they were heathens because they like to have a lot of sex.
Yeah, sexual exploration and
And that
just
made them
living a
bad.
non-judgmental lifestyle as a whole.
Right, and those people, those old people. I mean, they freaked out, and they they didn't want anything to do with that. So, but they weren't. They started off again as a peaceful people, and then if you end up, if you guys end up looking into it, or you end up, you already kind of know about it, then you know that eventually it actually went very bad,
Yeah, very fast.
very
too.
fast, and
Like I think the whole span of this was like 4 or 5 years.
it took a while, and so it ended up getting the Rajneeshis, which were again peaceful people, ended up pushing back, and they were sick and tired of being attacked. I mean, frankly, and they ended up doing some really awful shit
Well,
to the townspeople.
It's like the lady that was in Wild Wild Country. She said, she made that quote of, pick your enemies wisely because you become your enemies, and that's
Right.
essentially what happened. But then even beyond that, they in turn then became the enemy
Because
of
the
who they were
push.
fighting.
Right.
They ended up having to overcome that. So they ended up going to even more extreme measures. But then once they overcame it, they didn't stop. They just continued to go because
Right.
their enemies just became larger. It became a Thousand Friends of Oregon, and then it became the actual United States government. So it was
Right.
like each time that they took on these battles, it just got worse and worse and worse.
And it did. I mean, not to say that it wasn't difficult, but they did handle the situation incorrectly. I mean, imagine if they wouldn't have retaliated.
Right.
You know what I mean? I mean, granted, when you're talking revolution, there typically tends to be, some type of a bad there. But I don't know. It got too much, and that's where all of a sudden now the Rajneeshis ended up being volatile. They ended up being not a good cult,
Right.
So it's one of those things.
Well, and it wasn't even like the Rajneeshis as a whole. It was the people that were trying to protect the commune and protect, their vision. And I feel like they kind of got pulled off of where they wanted to go because there was so much outside source that was playing a role in the interference. They didn't really have a choice they had to move forward in some way, and they chose to move forward in, not the most pleasant of ways. And it's just, it kind of like puts things in perspective a little bit. Like,
Right.
you know, as you overcome certain obstacles in your life, that just welcomes in even harder obstacles to come in, because you're growing and you're doing more, and it's becomes battle after battle after battle. So it really just depends on what you believe in and how you portray what it is that you believe in. And these people ended up doing that in a very negative way and kind of gave themselves a bad name, even though they weren't bad people.
Well, I feel like it was just, again, just back to that, they started off with a really good vision. They had a really good reason to fight. And I mean, I'm not saying their reasoning to fight was bad, even after all that. But, I think that that the superiority got to them. I mean, I think that they ended up thinking that, they could then take over even more. I mean, even like, Baekwan, the leader, essentially, he got really bad into drugs and stuff. And it's just, he just took that wrong path, and, he let those, bad influences kind of take over. And, he kind of lost sight of his original idea. And so, it's just, again, I think with a lot of the bad cults, they just have that need to, at the end, I guess, when they've reached, cultdom, they just let those extreme ideals take over. And, it can be unfortunate, so like in the case of like the Rajneeshis, they started off really awesome and then ended up going into this dark thing. Or, of course they can be, they can have really bad, like they can already have like a bad idea in place, like Jim Jones. He was already a bad person. Like, he ended up creating a cult. I mean, this isn't exactly why, but he created this cult because he had issues of his own. I mean, he did it for the wrong reasons. And he ended up, I mean, I believe he was a narcissist. He ended up gaining all these followers and stuff like that. And then people started asking him, not people, but like the rest of the world was kind of looking into his cult and his ideals and stuff. And they were like, kind of questioning his way of life. For the simple fact that he was a cult leader, and he did have a cult. But, that's kind of where he took the turn and decided to kill, 900 people.
Right.
And obviously that's not good. So it just depends, and again, Charles Manson, he had this bigger idea of starting a race war and taking down the government and stuff like that. When, realistically, most people think that he just did it because he was jilted, because he was a songwriter, and he'd play the music too. And, he was never signed on to anything. As a matter of fact, he claims that certain musicians stole his music. And so he just wanted to take it out on when he assembled the masses and had the group go in and when they killed Sharon Tate and all those people, he thought that a certain music producer lived at that house, and that's not even where that person lived. And so the group went in and killed the wrong people anyway. So, and I guess at that point, I don't know, he already started, so he didn't stop. Which is an interesting thing. I mean, what is it? Why do these people follow, do you think? I mean...
I don't really know, because...
You just think they want to be a part of something, or...
Yeah, I think that a lot of people are lost and just kind of want to find a place to fit in.
Yeah.
And, then they kind of find that place that they feel like they fit in, and then it turns out to not necessarily be what they expected. But, it doesn't always affect that person directly. They might not actually even realize what's going on the higher up side. The higher ups could be doing some shady stuff, but the people that are actually following are, doing what they need to do. And the people that are actually representing these followings are actually giving the negative image. So really, you just never know if it's actually the following as a whole, or if it's just the individual people that play a major role.
Right, right. I mean, one thing that kind of makes a cult leader is that, they take in these individuals that are already kind of down on their luck, and, they promise them certain things. Going back to Joe Exotic and his two husbands, and not even just his husbands, anybody that he had working for him at his rescue at a zoo, were down on their luck people, but he had two husbands that were both straight, and, they married him, and that's because he fed them gifts, and, he fed them drugs, and he was trying to, kind of fill a hole in their life, which made them codependent. And so, I mean, that's, and that's what a cult leader does. I mean, they take in these people that are already broken, they're already searching for purpose, and they try to give them that purpose,
Yeah. They use their wants and needs to utilize gain.
Right, and it's a type of manipulation. Very similar in like domestic violence situations, where you end up becoming the victim of that is because, you've already got something going on, with yourself. You're already kind of soul searching, and here comes this person that seems great and wonderful because they are, they might be filling a hole in one aspect of your life, and while they're busy filling that hole, they're in your mind digging more. So,
yeah,
which makes it, again, not a good combination, but then you stay because they did, they held up their end of the bargain, so you feel like you have to, hold up yours. So, I mean, I don't know. I don't think that I would ever, join a cult. I just don't think, I'm pretty good about seeing through people's bullshit, so I don't think that's ever going to be a problem. I have been in a abusive relationship, and I know why now. I mean, when I go back and look at myself and see how I got trapped into that, I mean, then I could see, again, comparing those two, I could see how easy it is to fall into something like that because it does make sense.
Yeah.
But no, nowadays, I think I'm good.
Well, yeah, it's like my mom, well, me and my whole family were abused for years, and, it was physically, mentally, and emotionally, but then it was like, as a child, I watched my mom, get us out of that situation, and that wasn't an easy situation to move on from. But then she fell victim to just say mental abuse or emotional abuse or mental and emotional abuse because it doesn't have the physical aspect to come with it. It doesn't
Right.
seem as severe. So, as a child I would see that, and, even knowing what was going on, even to this day, like, I found myself in similar types of relationships, and I just kind of look at myself and I'm like, how did I end up here?
Because it's just it happens so fast. It's hard.
Kind of crazy.
It is, it's just, you don't even, and sometimes, I've had some relationships where I look back and, hindsight, man, it's a bitch. And then you start seeing things and you're like, wow, that really, it makes sense later on, because you couldn't see it then. You had your rose tinted glasses on,
Yeah.
and you're thinking that, this is good or whatever. So, I mean, I guess, yeah, I mean, I could definitely see how people, fall into that, that cult mentality on things. And, like I said, the word cult is much bigger than just, just
Well,
Heaven's Gate or whatever, Waco. It's bigger than that. It is.
Well, and when it comes to cults too, there's varying degrees too. It's like some people, like the Rajneeshis, they were involved with a lot of illegal activity, like immigration fraud and
Right.
tax evasion.
Right.
And yeah, that's wrong, but that's to a different standard than
Killing 900
right,
people.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and it's not
it's-
like
it
the
is different,
religious
yeah.
aspect of it,
Yeah,
or you know, the
right.
spiritual
Yeah,
part.
yeah.
You know, so it's kind of like the different elements that kind of come into play with different cults is kind of all over the place.
Right.
You know, different people. It all generally starts out the same, but then it all kind of crumbles for different reasons.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to be able to see, like, okay, well, this dude ended up convincing people to kill themselves.
Right. Right.
And then it's like, you know, these people just didn't pay their taxes.
Right.
You
Or,
know?
yeah, or they just hung out in the commune while the leaders poisoned an entire town.
Right.
You know, and they had no idea that was even going on. I mean, so it's not necessarily. I mean, that is the sad thing. I mean, the true victims of cults are the cult members. You know, they really, you know, take the shit end of the stick, and you know they're stuck with the mess because you know they're forever associated with that, or you know whatever. Politics in itself is kind of a cult. You know, the different sides of politics is kind of,
Yeah.
you know, because you know maybe your politician said something, you know, the one that you're rooting for, maybe they said something that is, you know, so important to you. Maybe they support a specific, you know, a specific way of thinking that is so important to you, you know, that you know you don't give a shit about what else they're doing, or you know whatever. You know, which is horrible, which we're not gonna, you know, get too much into politics
Right.
themselves. You know, but you'll ignore it. One thing that I had seen on social media one day was, you know, say you have a party, and say, you know, you invite the whole neighborhood, and you know, one neighbor comes in and shits on the floor. Okay. But they brought the best casserole in the world, okay? Everybody's digging this casserole. They're all eating it up, and it's wonderful, and it's great. You know, that doesn't negate the fact that guest still shit on the floor. You know, there's still shit on the floor. So, you know, it's like, you know, and that's kind of how, you know, that's kind of how we are as a people. I mean, as humans, we kind of just, you know, we tend to forgive pretty easily. You know, so, you know, and that's natural. There's nothing wrong with forgiving easily. You know, but there are certain things that you have to still kind of watch out for and have your boundaries on, you know, otherwise,
Right.
you know, you end up drinking the Kool-Aid.
Well, it's like, I had this one coworker, and, you know, he put it in, you know, we weren't talking about cults or anything, but he put, like, terms of being, you know, taken advantage of, you know,
Right.
if he called it the coffee table rule. If you have somebody
Okay.
come over to your house
Uh-huh.
and they put your feet on the coffee table,
Uh-huh.
and you don't say anything that first time, that allows them to basically have the upper hand, because then
Okay.
from that point on, they are under the impression that it's okay for their feet to be on the
Okay.
coffee table. So if you were then to, at a later date, say something like, hey, can you not put your feet on my coffee table? It's going to be like, okay, well,
You
why
let
is
me
it
do
a
it
problem
before,
now?
right? You let me do
then
it before, yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
in that instance, becomes more of an attack, quote unquote. But you know, it kind of comes down to the basis of cults. You know, you kind of come into these situations, and if you don't stand firm in what you believe, and you kind of justify the actions of others, then it just kind of becomes this vicious cycle of, you know, letting people get away with things that they necessarily shouldn't get away with.
Right.
And it starts out with small things,
Right.
and then eventually turns into bigger things, because kind of like with the Rajneeshis, where they, you know, their enemies kept getting bigger and bigger.
Right,
You know,
right.
so do their battles. And
Right.
that is essentially what's happening. Is each time there's this expansion, you know, it comes with, okay, we got to get more control. We got to get more followers. Whatever the instance may be.
Yeah. Well, like with Heaven's Gate, I mean, it didn't start off with, you know, hey, by the way, there's Space Jesus, and we're all
Right.
going to kill ourselves in order to meet him and get on his spaceship. Like, it didn't start that way.
Right.
If somebody came up to you on the street and said, you know, hey, would you kill yourself to meet Space Jesus? I mean, what are you going to do? You know, you're going to be like, fuck no, I don't want to be this space
like,
Jesus.
What kind of drugs are you on?
Right. And so, it didn't start off with, that. It's a slow build. It's a slow process. And, it starts off with, just the little things, the little lies here and there. And they might even make sense initially. Scientology is a lot like that. If you start looking into Scientology, in the beginning, when you really start looking into it, and I won't get too much into it because Scientology is just, I mean, fuck, we might have to cover that on another day. Yeah.
Right.
We might have to just cover Scientology one time. But if you start, like, reading into it initially, like, a lot of their ideas and stuff are pretty believable. I mean, they're pretty, it's really not that far-fetched. And then they get into just crazy shit. I mean, as it goes down and as you would end up, if you ended up putting in all the time and effort into the teachings, I mean, it just gets fucking nuts. And so, at that point, then like, okay, this isn't for me. Like,
right, like I'm in too deep.
Right. This is bad. And that's just any of them. They're all like that. They're all that way. And, most of them have that theme of, like, some type of theme of love to it, and you can apply that anywhere. I mean, Charles Manson, he was a big hippie, and he was attracting other hippies to his commune, and again, they're all about love and peace and greatness, and then they went on to kill people. Then you have the Rajneeshis were the same way. They were love and peace and tranquility and stuff like that, transcendence, and then they went on to commit these crimes and poison a whole town of people, and it's just all kind of has the same. The Big Cat people started off with, their vision was love. They loved these animals. And I think that they all of them truly did love these animals, but they all just lost sight, because they took it to that extreme, and they gained that superiority complex, and they just couldn't stop. I mean, it's almost, it's addicting. Well, it's like they say, once a dog draws blood, like it's right. Vicious for the rest of its life. And, there probably is some type of aspect to that. I mean, I believe that, it becomes addicting to gain that victory. Winning is great. Everybody wants to win, so why wouldn't they continue to, build and build and build upon that win? So I don't know, but I think that, the basics to it is, guys, don't go joining cults.
Yeah.
You definitely don't want to get mixed in with any of that. If you or a loved one are at risk for joining a cult, I'm just kidding. I don't have any advice.
Please email us.
Right, just email us at on Wednesdays we talk weird @gmail.com. we will personally drive to your house and or to their house.
Interview you and
we will interview you. Oh, yeah, for one, yes. If you are in a cult, if you have escaped a cult, or you were thinking about joining a cult, please, we would love to interview you. I think that would be really cool. But don't do it, guys. It's not a good idea. I don't know. I mean, with that being said, is there anything else we'd like to add to the cult talk?
I think it mostly just kind of boils down to not only the effect that these cults have on the members, but also the people and the immediate surroundings. It's like, even with something like, Harry Potter, like, people follow that like crazy. Like, everybody knows our houses. There's scarves and purses and, like, everything to just, like, signify what your house is. But then there's also people that aren't a part of that, it might seem minuscule, but they're just annoyed, and it aggravates them to see it.
Right.
And that's just, like, to put it on, like, a scale that's relatable in our day-to-day life. But I think a lot of it really, it comes down to, like, being, what's the time period? If it's like back in the days when the KKK was, like, huge, and I mean, it still is kind of huge.
That's
honestly.
Another cult, yeah.
In that time frame, a lot of those people thought they were right because it's what they were taught. So it also depends on the influence from our external environments that really play a role in what kind of shapes us and pushes us into these different groups of people that could be considered cults, and what that necessarily means. And I think a cult doesn't necessarily have to have a negative connotation, but it usually does. And
well, like,
that's the bad thing.
Like we kind of mentioned, like housewives earlier. So another kind of cult like mentality is, you know, you have these people like me, like I'm a single mom. Okay, I have a young child, and you know, people are kind of shocked because I still continue to have my own individuality and my own personality, instead of, you know, taking the fact that I'm a mom and just completely identifying with that.
Right.
And you know, that's kind of a weird kind of, that's a cult like mentality. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, why should you strictly identify with one thing? Just like you said with the Harry Potter stuff. Oh, so, you know, I love Harry Potter. It's great. It's wonderful. I mean, Harry Potter's cool, but like, there's people that like make it their entire fucking life.
Yeah.
Like that's all they talk about. That's all they want to watch or read or you know, get into, and that's, you know, that's pretty weird.
And that's, you know, why time periods have a role in that too, because
Right.
it's like, you know, that used to be like the thing, like a woman's place was in the home.
Right.
And that still to this day is a standard for some
It is,
people.
yeah.
And then so when somebody steps outside of those bounds, it kind of threatens their ideas of what makes a woman, what makes
Right.
a mother.
Right.
And, you know, I don't think that it's anybody's place to really decide on
What you
that,
do. Right.
Yeah, right. And, you
Or
know,
what that
so
means for you.
if somebody wants to be a housewife, great. You know, everything has its struggles,
Right.
everything has its positives and its negatives. And, you know, you just kind of have to weigh it out and see if it works for you. And
Yeah.
if it does, great. If it doesn't, you got to find something. You know, you can't just
Well, and again,
stick to it because it's what you know.
I mean, I think that, you know, the takeaway from this is just to not, don't let one thing consume your entire identity.
Right. Be in control.
That's where it's
of your
dangerous. Right. That's where it's dangerous. I mean, like, yes, it's great that you're a mom, you know, or whatever. But, like, you can do other things too. Do you remember? Do you remember what it was like before you were a mom?
life. Right.
You know, do you even have any idea that, you know, there's different hobbies and things that you used to like to do? Or whatever. I mean, whatever it is that you're applying to this case. I mean, again, it's good to keep an open mind about things. You know, but it's not good to obsess over any certain way of thinking. You know, because then that stops us from growing as a people. And you know, whatever. I mean, if you
It
want to,
just-
oh, go ahead.
Just like the cults, though. As
Right.
they grow, their battles get harder. So just
Right.
as we grow as individuals, the battle gets harder. We have
Right.
to continue to be ourselves, but also be those aspects of ourselves at the same time.
Well, I feel like we're getting a little spiritual here.
Yeah.
I think it's time.
Well,
for-
everything's kind of coming together, making me, not you, I guess, making me really think that humanity is the cult.
Ooh, that is deep.
I mean,
I mean, we kind of are in our own little.
right? How have we gotten our
sense.
direction all this time?
Yeah, that's true.
You know, like what is the big picture? Are we just a bunch of little cults within a giant cult?
Okay, listen, now you're just getting ahead of yourself. There's many more Wednesdays to come here, folks. What I was getting at was, I think, you know, with all the spiritual talk here, I think it's time to get into some tarot. I think we should do our weekly reading here. So it's that time of the week. It's the moment you guys have all waited for. We're gonna go ahead and do our weekly tarot reading here. What do we have to expect for the coming week?
So we ended up talking about time periods, and I happen to have my Deva Tarot with me, which is a vintage tarot deck, so I feel like it's kind of suiting for what we were just talking about.
What year is that from?
I believe 1986.
Okay, wow.
All right, so we got the Princess of Discs. Not dicks, discs.
Princess of Dicks, that's me.
And Princess of Wands, which, you know, could be Princess of Dicks.
Also me.
Because it's funny, the wands actually is in representation of...
Of the masculinity.
Yeah.
It's masculine.
So we have essentially an energy of standing in your power, but also being able to take a step back and re-examine kind of what it is that you envision for yourself, And then we also had the Two of Cups come out too. So, that can be signifying that there is going to be a unity of your creative passions and your home life or your physical reality. So being able to intertwine those two together in a way that makes your cup overflow.
Would you say there's abundance at play here?
There definitely could be abundance. So, I mean, we have the Two of Cups, which is, sometimes seen as, soulmates or divine counterparts. But that's not always the case. It could just be two different aspects coming into union. So if there's any kind of conflict that's been going on, it could resolve, especially if it is within the home or within your finances or anything like that. There could be a resolve on the horizon. But yeah, that actually sounds really good. So I think that's a really good reading because, we do have different aspects of ourselves, like we talked about a little bit, and we have to not only be those small aspects of ourselves but also ourselves as a greater whole. So being able to incorporate all of these tiny facets of who we are to express to the world kind of what we have to offer and what it is that we bring to the table. So I feel like there's a lot of expression that's going to happen that's going to really...
Well, and that really makes sense because a lot of people are, for one, everybody's spending a lot of time at home. It is a good time to sit and reflect on yourself with this time. And then, people in the arts community, I mean, you guys are really tearing it up. I mean, everybody's kind of found their voice right now. And
well, I mean, they have been for a long time, and I think people are now starting to realize, like, wow, the arts really do have a major impact in the world.
Right,
because
exactly.
What would we be doing at home?
Right,
we couldn't watch TV, we couldn't listen to music. Like, all of that is art, so it's like...
Right.
And I feel like that, could be, representing the Princess of Wands because, the Wands is all about creativity, passions, and fire. So, whatever drives you forward... Gotta express it. Right.
Oh, okay. Well, guys, let us know if that resonates with you at all. As always, we are, we're always open to taking in more topics. We did not pull from the jar during this episode, but that's okay. We'll figure out what we're going to talk about next week, and we'll be back here again. But I guess until then, I mean, we'll see you guys next Wednesday. Bye.
Bye.